Yeah.
Big story.
Right.
I understood over-under. Bigger story. Let's get to Week 7 in just a second, but we got to start in the NBA, where yesterday the league released their full 75th anniversary squad. Top 76 players of all time. There was a tie. Been a whole lot of controversy around some of the guys not on the list, but that were left off the list. We're going to call them snubs. Take a look at some of the notables. Vince Carter, Dwight Howard, Kyrie, T-Mac, Tracy McGrady, Tony Parker, just to name a couple of them. Klay Thompson, another notable snub, posted this on Instagram yesterday. Hey, maybe I'm just naive in my ability to play basketball, but in my head, I'm top 75 all time. All right, Nick, who was, in your opinion, the biggest snub from the NBA's 75th anniversary team?
Yeah, I'm going to say what everyone's thinking and get ahead of what I assume will be the dominating story today about this list, which is the Sidney Moncrief disrespect must end. Let me tell you about the Bucks and the... No, okay. By the way, Sidney Moncrief should have been on the list. However, he was not the biggest snub. I don't know how Sidney doesn't make the list. Sidney, I'm here for you, man.
I love Sidney, but no.
Dwight Howard not being on this list is an indictment of the entire list. If we're throwing guys off because they're unpopular, then someone tell Rick Barry, because he's out too. This is an indictment on the process, and it makes it seem a little too much like the cool kids table at lunch rather than the most prestigious group in NBA history. Dwight Howard, 3 times in his career, was the Defensive Player of the Year. Dwight Howard, 4 times in his career, was top 5 MVP voting. Dwight Howard was the best player and the only all-star caliber player on a finalist on a team that beat LeBron in the playoffs in a series. LeBron averaged 38, 9, and 9. Dwight Howard had a 5-year peak that rivals 35 guys on this list, dwarfs the peak of at least 15 guys on this list. And I'm not trying to kick guys off, but Ray Allen made the list. He, of course, never had a top 8 MVP finish, much less top 5. He was All-NBA twice. Reggie Miller made this list. He was 3rd team All-NBA 3 times. That's it. He never once finished top 10 in MVP voting. Paul Pierce made this list. He was 4-time All-NBA, 0 Bruce or Wilds. I'm not throwing Paul Pierce off the list. What I am saying is Dwight's resume, Broussard, is not borderline top 75. It's borderline top 45, unquestionably top 65, and probably somewhere in the middle between 45 to 65. He didn't get on the list because Shaq's made fun of him for a decade and because people don't like him. It's unfair. And that is, without question, the biggest indictment on the list as a whole.
All right, look, I'm certainly not putting him on the list over Ray Allen and Paul Pierce. There's an argument for Reggie Miller. But I do agree with you that Dwight Howard was the biggest snub. I could mention Vince Carter. I could mention Tony Parker. But I do agree Dwight Howard's the biggest snub. And it's similar to Vince Carter because they both had like 8-year runs of greatness, of absolute greatness. You mentioned Dwight, a 5-year peak where he was a top 5 player in the league. In those 8 years was about a top 10 player. The problem for Dwight is that, and look, and I'm with you, Nick, the committee of voters is supposed to be above this. The casual fan could fall for, well, the whole second half of his career, he's been a role player. All right, and they may not even remember how great he was. And it started with an injury. Let's say that, too. It didn't start with him just falling off. It started with an injury in Houston, and he's never been the same player since. All right, but again, the voters should be above that. And like you said, he became viewed as this giant goofball. All right, but like you said, Dennis Rodman's on the list. All right, so let me say this too. And I agreed with keeping all of the top 50 of the original 50 greatest players list on the top 75. It's hard to say I made top 50, but I didn't make top 75. However, there are at least, Nick, a dozen guys on the top 50 original list that really aren't top 75 players. And that's not era bias. That's guys that if we critique them by what we do today, did they win much? There are guys on that list that didn't win much, especially as the number one guys. How long was their run of greatness? There are guys on the list that didn't have a very long run of greatness, all right? So there's that, but I don't want to rip any of the old heads. New guys, you mentioned a few. I'm going to mention one from the modern era that Dwight should definitely be on before, Dennis Rodman. And Rodman was great. He was a tremendous defender. So was Dwight. He was an awesome rebounder, better than Dwight, but Dwight was an awesome rebounder too, very close to Dennis Rodman. And Dwight was light years ahead of Rodman in terms of scoring. And their era of greatness was about the same. Rodman had about 8 awesome years, like Dwight. I'm going to also mention another guy, and I wonder what your response on this, Nick. Anthony Davis. Now, if it plays out as we think it will, and maybe Davis wins more championships, maybe a finals MVP, it's different. But at this point, Dwight Howard over Anthony Davis all day, every day. Better rebounder, both great defenders. Anthony Davis scored more, but here's the thing. Dwight was the anchor, as you mentioned, of an NBA Finals team that beat LeBron. And Anthony Davis, in 7 years in New Orleans before he got to LeBron, made the playoffs twice as the number one guy.
And
won one
series.
playoff
That's
series.
Right.
And the injuries. So I would put him ahead of Anthony Davis as well.
AD, listen, the AD Dwight discussion is closer than people give it credit for the totalities of their careers. Again, if the time stopped today, which is the point that you were making. Now, where AD does get some check marks that some of these other guys I mentioned don't is he also has top 5 MVP finishes. He also has a handful of first-team All-NBAs, which matter a lot to me. We got to keep in mind when we're comparing All-NBAs, up until the late 80s, there was only first and second team All-NBA. So a guy like Reggie Miller, who has 3 third-team All-NBAs, if you played an earlier era, that gets you nothing. But as far as time stopping now, here's an example of why I think this is so unfair, Wilds. Damian Lillard is on this list. I'm fine with that. It was very, very close. But Dame has, at this point, played in his career about as long as Dwight before Dwight had the fall off. Dame has made All-NBA 6 times. Dwight did it 8, of course. Dame, top 5 MVP once. Dwight did it 4 times. And Dame has nothing close to the individual honor of the 3-time Defensive Player of the Year. It feels like what this list is telling me by including Dame and not including Dwight is if Dwight would have retired after his first year with the Rockets, he makes the list. That somehow he played himself off the list, which should not be able to happen. And so, like, it's to me, it's really, really unfortunate, Wilds, that this to me was about Dwight's personality. It was about that people don't like him, and so they penalized him, and that shouldn't happen.
So how much of it was about Dwight's personality, because I buy that, and Broussard, how much do you think it was about Dwight not reaching his potential? That we saw those first 5 years, we saw the defensive player year, we saw the finals appearance, that instead of going this way, it headed that way. And there's a certain recency bias to looking at your progress or decline and saying, well, the guy's constantly declining. Now, recently, he's had a little upwards tick in terms of likability and winning a championship. But how much of it is like, hey, you know what? We thought you were going to be great. We thought you were going to be the next Superman, but you sort of got tagged with like kind of being silly. You won the slam dunk contest. You had the awkward press conference with Stan Van. I think that personally was like the beginning of the end of sort of like, this guy's on the outs. So how much of it do you think is because he didn't reach his potential?
I think, Wiles, that's a big part of it. And I think that's the same thing for Vince Carter. That's the thing. When you play, like Vince Carter and Dwight Howard have played, 8, 9, 10 years as mediocre role players. I mean, really. And people forget how great you are. If you look at the modern era guys on the list, you never really saw them as mediocre players. they left maybe after a year or two, if that, of being okay. Okay, they didn't stay around to play for 10 years, come off the bench and things like that. So I do think that's a huge part of this. Nick, great point. Had Dwight retired after he left the Rockets, he probably is on this list.
Yeah.
But that's the problem with, I wouldn't say played his way off of it.
Continuing to play.
That's an interesting way
I think he did.
Putting it, yeah.
And one last point is the Dwight potential thing, Wilds. Everybody loves Shaq. Shaq has really twisted people's minds about something as factually based as how big is Dwight Howard. Shaquille O'Neal is 7'2", was the most physically dominating force in modern basketball. Next Lakers game you watch, look at LeBron and Dwight standing next to each other. Dwight's a little taller than LeBron. This idea that Dwight was supposed to be able to do what Shaq did and just easily score 30, he's not the biggest guy on the court. He had amazing athleticism for his size, but it was because Dwight called himself Superman and played for the Magic, Shaq put a target on his back, and I really think that helped pervert, if you will, America's expectations of who Dwight was ever going to be as an offensive player. Jen, it's not to let him off the hook for not evolving his game, but he was never going to be Shaq. He never could have been Shaq. Like, that's not a thing.
All right, well, besides Dwight Howard, Kyrie was the other big notable that we were all talking about in our morning meeting. Come up in a little bit. We're going to